Hi everyone, and I'm glad you're watching this because this wave summary chart I know was not the easiest assignment, but it's a great way to put information we have in a bunch of places all in one spot. So I'm going to go through it question by question rather than wave by wave because we learned about them one wave at a time, so this way we'll put it all together. So in the first wave, when Europeans started moving into the United States, we had a lot of people from England, Scotland, Ireland, also probably beginning to be a few from Germany, but most were from England, Scotland, Ireland. Those were the main countries. Now there were a few others that had people as well. There we go. All right. Then in the second wave is where we begin to see a huge influx of Germans. And I think you'll notice that Wisconsin became a state in 1848. And so it's not surprising that a lot of the groups you see in the second wave are going to be big parts of the people that settled Wisconsin. Germans obviously being a huge part of that. They're going to have Dutch, Belgian, and really a lot of places that are what we would call Northern and Western Europe were the people coming during that second wave. Norway, Denmark, those types of places. In the third wave, we see people from an entirely different part of Europe, the Southern and Eastern Europe. Really picked up during this time, and the number one country during this time by quite a bit was Italy. You see huge numbers of Italian immigrants during this time, lots of Polish immigrants, Russian, all people from the kind of opposite side of Europe. 1930 to 1965, this was the period where the quotas were in place. So there weren't a lot of people coming, but people who were coming had to be from these places in the first and second wave, because those were where they were allowed to come from. So, and then when you get into the fourth wave, that's where you see no longer is Europe the main source of immigration, but lots of people coming from Central America and Asia. Okay. So that kind of sums up where they came from during the different waves. Now, we know that one of the biggest reasons people came to the United States was the economic opportunity, the opportunity to make money, the opportunity to have a better life, be more financially secure. In the first wave, remember we had a lot of people who came as indentured servants, which is where you sold yourself into slavery for a period of 5 to 7 years. There was land available for people that were looking to farm, and those were probably two of the biggest ones during the first wave. During the second wave, farming was a huge one. Again, during this time is when a lot of the Midwest was opened up, and people were offered areas that they could come and set up farms. You also have during this time the building of railroads. We also have the gold rush in California. Those were three big things that attracted people to the United States, chances to make money. In the third wave, this is where you have a lot of factory jobs. The farmland begins to be harder to get. During this time, actually, the farmland that you could get turned out to be in places that weren't as great for farming, drier places. So lots of immigrants came during this time, ended up working in factories. Construction would also have been a big one during this time. During the restricted period, again, there was little immigration, and a big reason for that is the Great Depression. because there weren't jobs for the people that already lived here. There certainly were not jobs for people that were immigrating. So that was a big reason why you see during this period so many less people allowed into the country. Now, in the fourth wave of immigration, you'll actually see the largest area that people work in now is what are called service jobs. Restaurants, cleaning, yard, landscaping, and that's a big, where you see a lot of people that are immigrating now. Those are the jobs that are available. And if you think about it, even if you drive around and look at who's hiring, those people are always looking for people to work. Okay. Now, besides economic opportunities, there were push and pull factors at work. A big one in the first wave was religious freedom. A lot of the first Europeans to come to the United States came for religious freedom. So that was a huge part during that time. The second one, we have to mention the Irish potato famine, which reminds me we probably should go back, and the fact that I left out the Irish in our group up here was a mistake because they were the second largest group during this time. But millions and millions of people left Ireland because their crop failed. Another thing here was land in Europe was scarce for farming. During the third wave, there were lots of things going on, but here you start to see people fleeing more of some of the unfair governments. Think of Rifkin or family, and that was a big factor during this time. There were a number of wars going on in Europe as well that drove people out. And if you talk about into today, actually, if we go into that restricted time, a big one during this time would actually have been a number of Jewish people would have come to the United States had they been allowed, but a lot of them were turned away because of the quota laws. Nowadays, there are many wars. If you look at many of the areas, whether it be Mexico, whether it be other areas of Central America, there's a lot of whether it be civil wars or even violence going on. Okay, so in addition to the wars going on, there is again no jobs available in many parts of the world. Oops. All right. Now, in terms of the number of immigrants, I thought this was one of the ones that somebody came up with that I thought was pretty interesting. But you can see in the first wave, we have about 1.1 million people came to the United States. And that was over, again, it was over a 200-year period. So they were coming in very slow. The second wave, you actually see things really pick up. Almost 10 million people came in that 60-year period. The United States was growing fast, so it was a fairly open time for immigration. So lots of people were coming during that time. And then in the third wave, as we've said, that's when things really exploded. 22 million people arrived in about a 40-year period. By far the fastest rate of immigration, and that's why you're going to see some of the things like Ellis Island was put in place to handle the large number of people coming in at this time. Then it almost shuts off. In the next 30 years, you have only about 3 million people coming in, and now between 1965 and now, the number is 58 million, which again is huge when you look at this. But you do have to remember 1965 to now is about a 60-year period. This was about a 40-year period. So that changes things a little bit. All right. Immigration law changed in these different times. During this time, remember, the U.S. allowed only white immigrants at first. That actually reminds me, I need to go back up here and say, one of the groups that we need to make sure we have up in the who was coming during this time were the African slaves, because they were obviously not choosing to come, but still a huge part of the first wave. And we probably should put that under push-pull factors as well here. All right. So if you were choosing to come to here, you had to be white. The slave trade, which meant new slaves, were outlawed. So that practice stopped during this wave. But there wasn't a whole lot of law other than it said you had to be white. So when you get into the second wave, obviously at one point you have slavery is finally wiped out in 1965. And during that time, of course, the Africans who had been as slaves were now considered to be citizens. Of course, it was a slow process, but that's a whole other story. There wasn't a lot of immigration law during this time, but this is when there was the beginning. There were a few anti-Irish and anti-Catholic laws, especially in places with a lot of Irish immigrants like New York City. So when you get into the third wave, this is where Ellis Island is created. And throughout the time of Ellis Island, there were all sorts of different laws about, what your health status had to be, how much money you needed to have, did somebody need to be sponsoring you, did you have to be literate in your native language, able to read and write, and the restrictions kind of were changing often, but there were a lot more restrictions during this time. I'm going to get rid of that dash okay. Then at the end of this period is where you have the quota law. And this is where immigration was greatly limited and only for certain people. And again, the certain people would be your white, northern, and western. Oops. Tell you what, I'll put oh, that's bad. All right. So in that, I'll continue that over here. The quotas allowed people from Northern and Western Europe. Not much else. Also, I realize we're missing the Chinese. The Chinese Exclusion Act would have been during this time as well. Maybe I'll put that over here. And now immigration limited, but not based on where you are from. All right. Okay. The last one that people came up with that I thought was pretty clever was method of travel. So here you obviously would have had sailing ships primarily. The second wave is we would have seen a lot of sailing ships at first and moving into steam power. And again, as the steamship came, so the number of immigrants went up. So you have a lot of people coming in the third wave via steamship. Now today, you have people coming, some still by water, but you have lots of people traveling by land. And then also many arriving by air. All right. So that is the summary of the different waves, and I am just about out of time, so good thing we're finished.